Welcome to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now. I'm your host, Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with our senior analyst, Haviv Rettig Gur. Haviv, thank you as ever for joining me, and you solved the Israel-Iran war. Thank you for ending it for us.
Look, it wasn't easy. We all did our part, and I want to thank my team in the U.S., in Israel, obviously the Mossad. But what are you talking about?
Right, that war that ended a couple of days ago, just before the current crisis that we're going to discuss right now, the settler violence.
Yeah, Erdogan has already stepped into the breach of Iran's collapse and said, I'm going to lead the Muslim world now. And he's a Muslim brother who thinks Israel should be destroyed. No, there's no rest. There's no rest.
There's no rest for the wicked now.
No, but now we can refocus on Gaza. We can refocus on a lot of the insanity and I think just poor control of the territory and what's happening there in the West Bank, and we can focus on a lot of the things that need to be fixed. Yeah.
So for this episode, let's focus a bit on domestic Israeli society. And I'm talking about the settler extremists in the West Bank who have been attacking our IDF soldiers. And as you and I have discussed several times on the podcast, the IDF is one of the only institutions that most Israelis still trust and get behind. So this attack on our IDF soldiers is a huge attack on Israeli society. Would you agree with me, Haviv?
Yes. That is how everyone experienced it. This is Battalion 7114, who literally this is a group of extremists. It's weird to call them settlers. The vast majority of settlers think they're horrific. And it's just like, it's a little weird to call it West Bank. It comes off the tongue easily, but in Hebrew we say Judea and Samaria. That's literally the name of the territory in Hebrew, and it has been forever, and it will be. It's just the Hebrew name. There's a battalion of infantry in the West Bank that in the last 2 days has rolled up a terror cell that was going to carry out a terror attack out of Ramallah, found a bomb-making factory in Ramallah, and while it was patrolling the areas in which it has been operating, there was an ambush, literally a rock-throwing ambush by these Israeli extremists that, they fired back. The soldiers were hurt. These wild, insane extremists were everything that we've been saying about them. This is terrorism. Terrorism is not attacking soldiers. These are the same people who also burn houses in a Palestinian village 2-3 days ago. These are that branch of the tiny extreme that has an outsized influence because it's willing to be deeply violent. And every time it attacks Palestinians, it is an attempt in their own sense of themselves and what it is that their strategy is to attack Israel, the Israeli state, and the Israeli military.
So we are going to discuss the roots of the settler movement, how there are all types of different kinds of settlers, not just this fanatic extremist group that has been attacking our Israeli soldiers these past several days, and all of this and more when we're back.
I often say that if we can only do one thing well, what we need to do is to delight the customer. Our goal is that everything we do falls into the background and the customer has the experience of, wow, that was easy. And our challenge and what has made it most interesting along the way is to keep finding ways to deliver the personal connection and the personalized service in a virtual world. We consistently get feedback unsolicited from customers along the lines of, this is the best company that I've ever worked with. At the end of the day, it's the care that each member of the team takes that makes the entire experience what it is.
And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our senior analyst, Haviv Rettig Gur. So Haviv, for many people, the settler movement is in the same spirit as, for example, the settlement of pre-state Israel. It's the same spirit that the pioneers came and settled, all sorts of the land of Israel. but it has a bit of a different edge to it following the 1967 war. So tell us a little bit. Let's take a bit of a dive into history and talk about the roots of the settler movement.
The settler movement is enormous and enormously diverse. Now, enormous in Israeli terms. It's a few 100,000 people. Many of them live in Jerusalem, in municipal Jerusalem, in neighborhoods that are, according to, that are beyond the 1967 or 1949 ceasefire lines, which are sometimes usually called the 1967 lines. The neighborhood of Gilo, this working class neighborhood in southern Jerusalem where I grew up part of my childhood. The neighborhood of Neve Yaakov in northern Jerusalem, also working class. Also, I spent some years growing up there as a kid. Just because we were working class. My mom was studying archaeology, my dad was a cop, and they are technically, if you ask the European Union, settlements. But they're just very much attached to Jerusalem. They are, consecutive with Jerusalem. They're part of the Jerusalem urban sprawl. And that's a lot of settlers. And you have Haredi settlers and secular settlers and even left-wing settlers. And then you have these very religiously inclined, ideologically fervent and intense settlers. And on the edges of them, you have these extremists that we're talking about. So this is an enormously diverse group. And it really has a history of different movements, multiple different movements. So 1967 is, of course, the great war that begins this issue, this question. Israel has the borders that it manages to have, or the ceasefire line that it manages to reach in 1949 at the end of the 48 war. And then 19 years later, 1967 comes around. The Egyptians shut down the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. Israel's under a naval blockade. The radio of Syria and Jordan and Egypt talk about the destruction of Israel. And the Israelis are preparing. They don't know that they are this immensely powerful country, or rather they know that they're going to do well, but they don't know whether the Arabs are going to do well, because the Arabs have brand new Soviet-made militaries, and so they dig mass graves in Tel Aviv in the run-up to the war. There's absolute terror in the country before the war, and then the war happens. And within the first few hours, the Egyptian Air Force is wiped out on the ground. It doesn't even take off. There's a battle in the Sinai. The Sinai is taken. There's a battle in the north. The Golan Heights are taken, and those were, in a sense, war goals, in the sense that the Israeli military wanted to take a piece of the Golan Heights because Syrian artillery had used that highland overlooking the towns of the Galilee to shell the Israeli communities in the Galilee, and they wanted to push them past a distance too far for them to have line of sight into those towns for artillery shelling. And so there were plans that if war should come, we will have more defensible borders. That was a goal. In the West Bank, that was not the goal. So much so that Central Command Commander Uzi Narkis at the time said that the Israelis tried to actually get Jordan not to join in the war. Jordan controlled the West Bank, had claimed to annex the West Bank. I think its annexation was recognized by Britain and Pakistan and nobody else. And then Jordan enters the war. And Narkis' strategy is basically to just send battalion after battalion that frees up from the northern front or the southern front to a different area, to a different region of the West Bank, to take it to various cities, to various regions, mountains. And there's a famous and really quite dangerous battle in Jerusalem. The Israelis won't employ any kind of heavy artillery in the old city of Jerusalem, in the conquest of the old city. They don't want to destroy the old city, right? It's holy and ancient and all this old stuff is there. And by the end of 6 days, on all the fronts, Israel had quadrupled in size. And in the West Bank, it finally found itself for the first time two things. One, controlling the mountains that overlook the coastal plain where most Israelis live. In other words, you can't shoot at them from just line of sight of the highlands that overlook most of their population. The coastal plain is 9 miles wide, right in the middle of the country. Israel was 9 miles wide in the middle, and now it no longer was, because it controlled these mountains above it, and it stretched out to, I don't know what it is, 80, 100 kilometers, something like that. And it was the biblical heartland. In other words, the Israeli Jews had now come back, and that was what the music was about, what secular Israelis talked about, just as an identity question. All the Bible takes place in the West Bank. None of the Bible takes place in Tel Aviv, which is, of course, why Tel Aviv is so much more fun than the West Bank. But that's going to get emails. I apologize, everyone. But, it's where everything happened, and the crucible of Jewish story and identity and the Bible and all of it, and the names and the places, and that includes the old city of Jerusalem. When the European Union talks about a settlement, they are including a Jew living in the Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem. And that Jewish quarter was destroyed in the 19 years of Jordanian rule, literally demolished, medieval synagogues razed to the ground on purpose, purposefully to erase Jews from Jerusalem. And now they're back and they're rebuilding. And so there was this thrill of that experience. And it created basically what are today three different settlement movements. And they were created at different periods of time. The first settlement movement was the left-wing one. And the left-wing settlement movement was a very interesting one because it was not this, inspired religious return to the homeland kind of a movement. There was a guy, a general, a former general, then a minister, then just a generally well-known Israeli named Yigal Allon. Yigal Allon came from the Mapam party. He was the most successful general in the 1948 war, and he had been a minister of government and an ambassador, I believe, in London. And Yigal Allon, within 3 weeks of the 1967 war, came to the Israeli cabinet with a map, with a suggestion. And it's since been called the Allon Plan. And the Allon Plan is basically what left-wing Israel needs from the West Bank to this day. I mean, it's never adopted as an official policy, and there were multiple different versions of it. But Allon said a very simple thing. Because God loves us, I'm joking, he's an atheist communist, but because God loves us, all the Palestinian population centers are on the watershed down the West Bank, meaning the West Bank is a mountain range. And the watershed is the part of a mountain range where the water switches sides. In other words, the water is falling, rain's falling. The tip top, that line of tip top where it switches from falling from one side to the other, that's the watershed. And the watershed of the West Bank, this north-south line, begins in the city of Jenin in the north, then Nablus, or Shechem in Hebrew, then Ramallah, East Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Hebron. And that's the vast majority of Palestinians living in the West Bank. And I can't shrink down to 9 miles wide. I can't do it. It's too dangerous. And so we can solve all these problems in one fell swoop. And here's how we do it. We take the Jordan Valley. We hold on to it. That's Israel. We push up the mountain a tiny, tiny bit from the coastal plain, just so we're not literally at the bottom while they're on top, aiming at us any weapon they want. And we expand out a little bit of Jerusalem, which is surrounded by mountains, and there's no way to protect it if you don't control the mountain around it. And everything else can be a Palestinian state. And some versions of the Allon Plan that Allon himself suggested, they attach themselves to the Jordanian Hashemite kingdom. Some of them, they're totally independent. Some of them, but he literally talked about a totally independent state with its own foreign policy, its own control over itself. And there's a corridor through Jericho on the border between the West Bank and that plan. People should Google the Allon Plan, and they will understand the ideal of the Israeli left for generations.
Haviv, a question for you. The map that we see, the Allon Road, that is basically the plan brought to life, isn't it?
Yes. So the Allon Road, stretching from Road 1 on the way down from Jerusalem to Jericho up through the West Bank, it's different things. It's named for him. But it's said to also follow the line, and I have to look up if it exactly follows the line. I suspect that it doesn't in many places. It's also been changed over the years, but it kind of follows the line of the Jordan Valley piece that Israel needs to defend itself, which is to say not just down in the valley, but also part of the mountain. The point is that you can create a contiguous 2/3 of the West Bank that is a Palestinian state attached to Jordan. This was the Allon Plan, along with Gaza, and you hold the Jordan Valley, which is almost empty of population. There's a few Bedouin villages along the actual valley, and there's the city of Jericho, which is small. It's a small city. It's, I think, today no more than 70,000 people, and back then was much, much less. And those are obviously annexed into Israel, but also given Israeli citizenship, right? That's how you solve that problem. And that was the concept of the Allon Plan. Now, there is a string of settlements down the Jordan Valley to this day, founded in the early years after 1967 by the Israeli left-wing governments. There would be left-wing governments until 1977, that are meant to be fortresses preventing an invasion from the east, a Jordanian, an Iraqi invasion, both of which had armies invade very recently, if you're 1967, into Israel. In 1948, there were Iraqi tanks in Tulkarim and Kalkilia on the West Bank. So Israel holds it as a border, but the mountain range, and it maybe moves up the mountain a little, but the mountain range itself is Palestinian and is part of this larger state with Jordan, or a separate state, or whatever it wants to be. That's the concept, and that's a left-wing security concept. And you have, for example, kibbutzim in the Jordan Valley called, one is Niran. Niran in recent elections has voted for, recent 30 years of elections, has voted for its own dissolution. What do I mean? They're in the West Bank, but they voted for left-wing parties that wanted to create a Palestinian state where they are. And that's produced by an old left-wing tradition of a socialist kibbutz settling there as a security front in the hopes of someday reaching a point of the Alon plan, which would make Israel safe and not rule over millions of Palestinians. And that's one group of settlers, is the security-minded set. Now, since then, they're not such old socialists. There are many other groups, but they're basically a security, right? The neighborhoods built around Jerusalem and the mountains around Jerusalem are part of the idea that you can't protect Jerusalem if you're hunkered down on one hill and there are higher mountains around you. The two largest settlements, there are something like 105 settlements. Two of them are a quarter of all settlers. They're cities, and they are Modi'in Elit and Beitar Elit. They are both Haredi cities. They're on the road northwest out of Jerusalem and on the road southwest out of Jerusalem. The two major highways coming into Jerusalem, one from Tel Aviv, one from the south, and they push back the security sort of the protection of those roads to Jerusalem one more hill, one more mountain. Now, they are Haredi cities. They're not there for ideology. They're there for housing. Their median age is something like 11. Average family sizes are like 10. I mean, can you imagine having 7, 8 kids? It's absolutely crazy and insane and
it's
probably
like
unhealthy.
Sound of Music level. It's crazy.
It's crazy.
Borschel-Dan household level. Yeah, that's weird.
That's the average. Yeah. People who watch this know that, right? That was a joke about you having 7 kids.
So, yeah.
Okay. So that's housing. That's the second group. And it's also mixed into security, because why were those cities placed there? They were placed there to hold the road. Now, these are cities within 2,000 feet of the Green Line. And the point is that the major highways that cut through the mountains, which is not an easy thing to do, and that you can't just send the road going anywhere, are protected. And so it's part of the protection of Jerusalem. They're literally just the roads up to Jerusalem. And you begin to map out settlements in that way, in terms of their fundamental logic. And you realize that you have this the earliest settlement movement was this left-wing security settlement movement. And then you have this just housing settlements that are placed in certain places to overlap with that security concern. Most settlers live very close to the Green Line. 70%, whatever it is. And then you have the last 30%, 25%, give or take. And they are the religious Zionist settlement movement. They begin in a tiny little group that settles in Hebron against the government's wishes. A small little group that goes back to Gush Etzion, south of Jerusalem. Gush Etzion were massacred in the 48 war. It's a return. It's a triumphant return. It's a rehabilitation. It's a healing. And it feels that way to the labor government as well. It's not just to religious Zionism. But fundamentally, the religious Zionist idea is the Jews are back. They're back in the old city. They're back at the Wailing Wall and the Temple Mount. They're back in the road to Jericho. They're back in all of the Torah's path down the Shiloh Road in the West Bank. They're back to the old and ancient homeland. And that can't be an accident. In other words, you don't have to believe in God, and you certainly don't have to believe in the Bible, but if you happen to ever read the prophets of the Bible, they talk about the worst times and the best times, the greatest good and the greatest evil, and all of it concluding with the mass return of the Jews to their homeland. And the religious Zionists are like, guys, if the 20th century isn't that, nothing makes sense. Okay? It should, that isn't that the 20th century? And they build this vision of a return based on the mystical writings of Rav Kook and many, many others. But what the point is, it's a religious movement that believes that the founding of Israel has significance in the Jewish vision of a redemptive arc to history. And therefore, the Jews have to return to their homeland as a matter of the redemption of the world. And therefore, they can't give it up to the Palestinians ever. And therefore, they often built many of their villages and towns right in between major Palestinian population centers. So if the other parts of the movements, I don't even know if you'd call them movements, if most Israelis living over the Green Line are living adjacent to the Green Line, are pushing the security border, as the Israelis see it, one more mountain over, these are this group, this quarter, this third, whatever the exact number is, the purpose is the prevention of a Palestinian state, and so they're right in between Jenin and Nablus, and they build a town right in between Nablus and Ramallah, and the purpose is that a contiguous Palestinian state is never possible, and so it's never actually accomplished. And those are basically, I don't know if that's 3, that's 4, there's a lot of overlap, but those are basically the different groups. You have a great many settlements around Modi'in. Modi'in's on the Israeli side of the Green Line, but where Israeli civil law is in force. But right across the line, you have places like Hashmonaim, like Nili. They're a 25-minute commute to Tel Aviv because the coastal plain is so narrow. And so you have just, left-wing high-tech people who can't afford Ramat Gan, which is right next to Tel Aviv, so they move a little farther out. All these different groups of people, it's hugely diverse. The word settler fails to encompass any of that diversity. And that's it. That's the many different kinds of settlers and where they come from.
I want to just add a couple of things to what you said. There are currently about 500,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank. I checked the statistics today with a professor who deals with this, and that's excluding East Jerusalem. So with East Jerusalem, including the neighborhoods that you described that you lived in yourself, Haviv, when you were a wee lad, it would be several 100,000 more. So we're almost at around 1 million or 700,000 plus at this point in terms of who would be called a settler in sum total. And just to also emphasize the diversity of the settler movement, there are locales in Israel such as Haradar, which is half a settlement and half not a settlement because of just how poor the planning was in terms of when it was being built. And so we have, in fact, a colleague, I asked her the other day, so are you considered a settler? And she's like, I think part of my house is, but another part is not. So some of this is, of course, happenstance as well. Now we're going to take a break, and then we're going to talk about the extremists a little more.
You all started with, what's a vision of the Jewish life you want to create?
Why do you want to have Jewish spaces?
Yeah, why should I be Jewish?
And why pushing back in the most respectful way possible.
Don't be respectful, I'm an Israeli.
Welcome to Future Tense,
A show that puts today's biggest Jewish questions
In the hands of the leaders of tomorrow.
What does that speak to you about our role as American Jews?
Is it about spirituality? Is it about the way you connect to your community? Is it about the way you feel about God?
What if I find a space that excites me spiritually, but that holds serious contradictions with values I care about?
Adults and parents asking me, how is it? Is everything okay? Are there encampments? Are there protests? They ask us and then they still don't listen.
What happens when their commitments do conflict?
I want to agree with you fully, but I think there is something that makes me a bit uncomfortable.
If you want to connect with Jewish people and the only thing happening is a gefilte fish tasting, you might not eat the gefilte fish, but you'll go to be with Jewish people.
Just get along? What does that mean?
This is just like a hot issue, and it is very difficult to actually say your opinion on it.
But these questions are knocking at young Jews' doors, whether we invite them or not, and I think we should welcome them.
This is Future Tense, a new podcast from the Shalom Hartman Institute.
And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our senior analyst, Haviv Rettig Gur. We opened the program describing attacks on IDF soldiers that have taken place over the past several days. And initially, after the Friday attack, we heard some voices out of the government that seemed to condemn the IDF for using procedures that they would use on all terrorists, on these Jews who were terrorizing at least the IDF. And then finally today, we're recording on a Monday night, we heard these same voices actually change their tune a little bit, modify their remarks, and they seem to understand, at least from my perspective, that things have gone awry, things have gotten out of hand, especially with this small fanatic fraction of the settler movement. Many people would call them the hilltop youth. I don't think they're only youth and they don't only live on hilltops, but it is this archetype, this stigma, this stereotype, the hilltop youth that are now in the focus of our discussion. So where did this hilltop youth movement begin, Haviv?
There is a religious Zionist settlement movement that talks about returning to the heartland. There is a huge range of opinion. There are very, very, I don't know what to call them, liberal, even I would say progressive groups. For example, Tkoa, down by Bethlehem. Tkoa is founded by quite a few Anglos, Americans. Had a rabbi named Froman who explicitly talked about doing interfaith work and coming closer and reconciling with Palestinian neighbors. And if peace meant a Palestinian state, he would stay there as a Palestinian citizen in a Palestinian state. The land was the land, it was the redemptive land, and Jews should be on the land, and it's independent of the politics. And if God decrees that a Palestinian state is founded now, a Palestinian state is founded now. And it's a community that has also produced a lot of these initiatives, like Shorashim, which is an initiative where Israelis reach out, Palestinians reach out, and they try to build dialogue groups together and support groups together and overcome the sort of ethnic war that separates them. And then you have, all the way on the other end of that spectrum, you have very ideologically fervent and just open calls to violence to drive out the Palestinian population. The most extreme you can imagine the most extreme you can imagine, and then add 10%, and you get to some of these groups. Now, both of those are edges. Everybody is somewhere in the middle. And if you poll them, the polls are heavily dependent on events. So in the immediate aftermath of 3 suicide bombings in Jerusalem in the middle of the Second Intifada that week, polling is much, more clearly to the right edge of that spectrum. And when there is a sense that there is movement on a peace process, polling does shift in the other direction, even as many fear that a peace process would take away from them their home and take away the project of settling in the heartland, in the biblical heartland. Nevertheless, there's also among them larger numbers that pull the averages, who say, look, if peace is actually possible, I'm not going to stand in the way. So, for example, in the settlements in the Gaza Strip, there was the disengagement. The disengagement in August of 2005, when the government of Ariel Sharon said, we're leaving Gaza. There's 8,000 Israelis. There was something like 1.5 million Palestinians. We're not sticking around. There's no game plan for that. And they pulled them all out. Now, the Israeli government offered to buy the house of anyone who leaves beforehand. And essentially, basically, it was a complicated formula, but the legislation for it, a lot of that legislation that would come after, also to compensate many of them, was written in part by my wife, who worked on it a great deal and in the negotiations. And the government tried to offer, to tell people, if you leave, the Israeli state sent you to Gaza, you had this sense of mission. It was almost entirely a religious Zionist project, the settlements in Gaza. If you leave, the state will compensate you for having sent you there. You will have a house back in Israel. Half of them left ahead of time. Half of them did not have to be dragged out. The other half had to be dragged out. But that is to say, there's a very broad spectrum of how people deal with this and understand this story. So the extremists are young people, many of them, though there are rabbis that back them and talk about the need to conquer and talk about the need to expel. But the movement and the people who turn violent are young people, many of them troubled young people. Many of them troubled young people from families off on these hilltops living without running water and consistent electricity. And they find deep meaning in belonging to this radical thing. The ideas underlying this radical thing are very interesting. They're these There's like European romanticism there. There's religious Zionist mysticism there. There's like all these things percolating all together, and it ends up producing an ideology of deep belonging to the land, a rejection of modernity, a rejection of authority, a rejection of institutions, a rejection of the Israeli state, but not of the sovereignty of Jews. And so you have, for example, the extremists who burned a couple of houses and started a big fight in a Palestinian village, I think a week ago, something like that. I tweeted very angrily against them that they're terrorists and it's, high time we get rid of them. But we've reached a point where it's complicity if we don't actually crack down. This is a breakdown of law and order. And people came at me. And I think, I have more than 50,000 followers on Twitter, on X, and 2 of them came at me with this angry Kahanist sort of racist stuff. And I blocked them for their own emotional well-being. I don't want them to read things that make them so troubled. But most people came at me with very serious questions and concerns and arguments about, look, what are you talking about? These guys aren't the problem. These guys are fringe. There's a few of these things happen occasionally over the course of the year. There's much bigger problems to fight. Everyone's suffering, and there's just not that many of these attacks. But these attacks are terroristic in intent. Their point is, burning cars, sabotaging, setting houses on fire, setting olive orchards on fire. The point is to terrorize the population and make people want to leave. And it's time to crack down on that, and it's long past time to crack down on that. I wrote that tweet, and I had people come at me and say, are you on our side or on their side? And I pointed out that these same people routinely attack IDF soldiers, routinely, violently attack our own people and the state of Israel itself. This is a campaign that sees hurting Palestinians as a way of getting at the authority of the state of Israel. And sure enough, within a week, Battalion 7114 in the Ramallah area literally intercepts a terror attack in the making. And as it's driving down the road into one of these hilltop outposts of these extremist youth, there's an ambush, a rock-throwing ambush in which soldiers are wounded. So I'm just saying that to say, told you so. But the point is that these are young people with this whole ideology that pits them against the Israeli state as well. And the army has now responded. It hurt one of the kids in the exchange of blows mostly, but apparently a kid is also moderately wounded from a gunshot. I don't entirely know all the details of the story, and not all of it has come out yet. There's some ambiguity about exactly what happened. And then there was a protest by these hilltop youth, as they're called, somewhere in the Benjamin Regional Council, which is the Ramallah area. They actually set fire to some military post. And in response, the army today took down 6 of their outposts by force. And so there's now a tit for tat between the army and these kids who are attacking the army as part of this grand ideology that also sees them attacking Palestinians and their villages. So we have this extremist group. Now, how many settlers want to attack the IDF? The settlers outside of certain towns around Tel Aviv, where all the pilots live and all the commandos live, the settlers are the highest rates of service. The religious Zionists specifically have obviously not Beitar Elite, which is entirely ultra-Orthodox, but the religious Zionist communities in Judea and Samaria have the highest levels of military service of all Israelis. They love and are defined and are deeply invested and sacrifice to be at the frontline units in the service of the IDF, defeating Israel's enemies and protecting the country. And so these kids are the extreme of the extreme. But this government happens to include the extreme of the extreme. It happens to include the single most right-wing politician in Israel that it's impossible to find someone to his right. That's not true. There's technically a couple of guys literally to his right, but he ran with them in the past. And that's Itamar Ben-Gvir. And Limol Son Har-Melech is a politician in his party. And she came out in defense of these kids. And so you have, she wants answers from the army about why one of them is wounded. I don't want answers about why one of them is wounded. I want answers about why all of them and everyone who belongs to any organization related to them isn't in prison.
Or why a 14-year-old is out throwing rocks without any kind of, parental guidance, etc.
Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich of the Religious Zionism Party has tweeted in the past about the army facing Palestinian rock-throwing youth, that someone throwing a rock is taking their lives in their hands, and it deserves death because that is an attack that is potentially deadly, and we don't have to play games with these things. And those tweets of his past about Palestinians throwing rocks have now been brought forth, as they should be, because here we have Israeli kids throwing rocks. Do they now deserve death? Do we open fire? Why should a soldier have to take a heavy rock thrown to his head and suffer for the rest of his life or be killed on the spot because they can't open fire? And so, there's a hypocrisy here, but there's also a willingness to tolerate this violence, a willingness to tolerate this extremism on the I would say right-wing sections of religious Zionism, but those right-wing sections are not the edges. So the edges themselves are violent. Smotrich loves soldiers, cares about soldiers, takes care of soldiers. His community believes in serving in the army. They're on the soldier side of the debate, put it that way. But they're willing to tolerate these extremists because they feel like they're from their own camp. And so there is this tolerance, even if not agreement, that is, I think, deeply problematic because it allows the problem to grow and fester. These are the kinds of ideologies that don't go away. You have to actually crush them. And I think it's high time that happened. And we're going through that moment right now in the Israeli news cycle.
I just want to add to the mix another layer of nuance that many of these, so-called hilltop youth will serve in the army, be it through one of the special units for, religious, even troubled youth, such as Netzach Yehuda, which I think you kind of served in its prototype when you were in the army, if I'm not mistaken. So they could be serving in this, and it is a way for society to rehabilitate these people. But it also means that some of these, so-called hilltop youth are going home from the army with a weapon and a uniform and wearing half their uniform when they're going out and terrorizing the neighborhood Palestinian village right next door. And I also want to add another layer to this, that there's this sense of betrayal. I think a sense of betrayal from people who are not part of this, far right ideology, but just this red line that was crossed in which you raised your hand against your brother, potentially, meaning it's quite possible there is a family in which one of the sons is this hilltop youth kind of extremist, and his brother is serving in Gaza right now, trying to protect the country. And this is where things get very, very muddy and very, very hurtful in a way for Israeli society.
Right. And it's important to say that they come from a sense of the state betraying them. And everything that happens with these violent Jewish extremes is born in that sense. And why? This phenomenon of hilltop youth, talking about Noar HaGvaot, literally youth of the hills, it comes from basically the Oslo years. And the idea that Israel is run by elites, by parts of Israeli society that don't believe in its divine mission and its destiny, and they are therefore betraying that mission and destiny. And while they betray that mission and destiny, they throw those Jews who stay loyal to the great mission and destiny to the dogs. They throw them to the side. They betray them as well. And that's us, this movement is born in settlements that lie deep within the West Bank and right up against Palestinian population centers. Yitzhar, Itamar, Eli, these are places people can look up. That's where these things are first seen as a phenomenon. And so it's not under the Oslo process or under any peace process that's ever been suggested. Most of you draw the border 2,000 feet in one direction or another, you solve 70%, 80%, whatever it is of the settlement question. But you can't solve Eli and Itamar and Yitzhar and those places. And so they are the places that felt very much singled out and in danger. And the great mystical religious mission is in danger, and these young people who come often, I would even say usually, from various kinds of broken homes, for one reason or another, they found deep meaning in being a rebellion against the IDF, against the government, against a state that has been insufficiently pious, too democratic, and being that rebellion that says we're going to hold the line here and all of this. But, to most Israelis, they are saboteurs, and they are shameful, and they bring violence to ordinary, Palestinians who have no affiliation with terrorism. They're part of the price tag phenomenon. The price tag attacks, in many places, there developed a kind of tit for tat between violent Israelis and violent young men, basically, of a Palestinian village nearby. And the tit for tat, price tag, the response, the revenge. But price tag doesn't always mean that. There's often a price tag attack, tag mechir, that's something they would spray on a Palestinian village as they go through and vandalize it. The price tag is not a price tag targeting the Palestinians. It's not revenge at the Palestinian village. Very often what they mean is the Palestinian village did nothing. The Israeli government did something to them. But the Israeli government cares more about Palestinians being hurt, their narrative goes, than it does about them. And so how do you hurt the Israeli government? You hurt Palestinians. And so there are this discourse that is now 30 years old. Some of these hilltop youth are in their 50s, and they're no longer on any hilltop, but there are new hilltop youth that replace them. And it's an anti-state, anti-democratic in their own conversations, in their own talk of themselves, and deeply unhealthy phenomenon that produces just the literal textbook definition of terrorism from the Israeli side. So they're the edge, the extreme. They are a rebellion against Israel as much as they are a terror attack, a terrorist movement against Palestinians. And nevertheless, they are there, and they are protected by some of the edges of this government. And that makes this a politically difficult thing to crack down on. The good news is that over the past couple of weeks, they've overdone it. And they've attacked IDF soldiers. And they've attacked combat soldiers in the middle of anti-terror operations to protect Israelis. And there's very little patience for them right now. And the army, in response, took down 6 of their outposts. And that is exactly the language they understand. And we should have more of it, because I'm sorry to be non-journalistic here for a moment. With all due respect, and that's not much respect that I have, but this can end. This needs enforcement. When Palestinian organizations produce these kinds of attacks, we call it terrorism, and we employ counterterrorism measures. And sometimes that means arrests, and sometimes that means administrative detention, meaning detention without trial because there's not enough evidence for a trial. But when you arrest the 14 people you suspect, all the terrorism goes away in that place at that time. And that is a legitimate tool. I, by the way, have thought for many years that is a very problematic tool, and and we should not be using it, and certainly not the scale that it got used. The problem is that it works. And so it was used for Palestinians. It was also used a little bit for these extremist Israelis. I think that should be expanded. If it is a legitimate tool, it's a legitimate tool for these people who are in a full-fledged rebellion against the state of Israel and ultimately cause terrible harm to the state of Israel, and also, of course, to the Palestinian victims that they often victimize.
We could so easily wrap up here, but I think the big stumbling block in your idea of enforcement is, of course, that the National Security Minister is kind of the poster child for many of these hilltop youth. He's the one who made it good. He's the one who is the linchpin in the government. He's the one who holds the whole coalition in his hand. And so how are we supposed to have some kind of redemption of these hilltop youth when they see in front of their eyes that one of their own ostensibly has made it and could be, who knows, even one day prime minister?
They get a lot of protection, direct protection, by Ben Gvir banging on a table and saying, no, you won't. But he has no actual authority over them. Authority over them lies squarely with the Defense Ministry, because the area where they work, where they carry out their attacks, is entirely the West Bank, which is under military rule, officially, legally, under Israeli law. And so it's the army's decision, and the army has issued many orders against their best known activists, their most influential activists over the years, kicking them out of the West Bank. kicking them out of any areas where they can. But it hasn't gotten. The army hasn't used the kinds of toolkit it developed in order to stymie Palestinian terror organizations. It hasn't used the toolkit it develops when it does a sweeping raid of 15 Hamas people in Hebron, which recently the army has been focusing on new Hamas infrastructures in Hebron and has arrested some of its leaders and some of its guns and bombs and all this stuff that they were collecting and building. That's the kind of toolkit you need to use if you actually want to take this kind of guerrilla activity and actually suppress it. And just because, and they'll attack soldiers. They'll physically, violently attack soldiers. So just because they have a protector in government from the most extreme party in Israeli politics doesn't mean you don't do it. Yes, we have a prime minister who laundered Ben-Gvir. 3 years before setting up a government with Ben-Gvir, he told the press, he gave an interview on television in which he said, "I'll never sit with Ben-Gvir," which is when people like me started to suspect that he was planning to sit with Ben-Gvir. And Ben-Gvir supports it. Ben-Gvir supports it. Now, Ben-Gvir has in recent years, begun to talk a little more maturely. He's gotten older. He wants to launder himself. He wants to expand his appeal. He's already in the cabinet. He wants people to think he's a serious guy. And so now he says things like, that's not the right way. The long march through the institutions is the right way. They're not listening. And the violent groups and the terror attacks on Palestinian villages and the attacks on IDF soldiers, they continue. In some places at certain periods, they grow. It's time to crack down. It's time to end it. It's not a legitimate thing.
It's time to crack down. It's time to end it. But the new defense minister, of course, ended any kind of form of administrative detention for Jews when he entered office.
For Israelis.
Yeah. So that tool is, again, outside of the toolbox. I know we're not going to solve this. We're not going to crack this nut.
But it's just his decision. In other words, I'm saying he should restore it when you have terror suspicions. Or we get rid of it completely. Let's get rid of it completely. But if it really works and terrorism is a real problem and it's an ideologically driven terrorism, so it's not like something that you can solve by ending the occupation, which is something everybody thought until every attempt to end the occupation ended in rivers of blood and mass terror because there are ideologies on the other side committed to not making a peace with two peoples, but making sure one wins and one loses and God's on their side. So why not always end every peace process in rivers of blood? So if you're then going to have an anti-terror policy and there's no other way to do it, fine, great. But Jews too. And why Jews too? First of all, because they deserve it, they earn it, they're hurting people constantly. They're hurting the country, they are destabilizing, frankly, the West Bank, and they're undermining the military and they're undermining government policy, and they're good for nothing, for nobody. Nobody wants them. Nobody wants them there. The settlement movement considers them an incredible liability. The leadership considers them an incredible liability. Back in the day, the leadership of the regional councils of Israeli towns and villages in the West Bank openly opposed them, talked about the danger, talked about the problem. Now nobody really talks, but also there aren't the kind of famous influential leaders of the settlement movement that there used to be. So nobody cares what the mayor of, the Binyamin Regional Council thinks about this.
Because they're sitting in the government already. The defected, the leaders of the settlement movement are in the cabinet.
Maybe they don't feel like it hurts them. Maybe they don't feel like it matters if people think that they are tarnished with this, with that brush. Maybe that's it.
Haviv, you and I both feel very deeply about this subject, and I have a feeling we're going to discuss it again in the future. I thank you so much for taking so much time and speaking with me about it today. And listeners, if you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please feel free to drop an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. So, Haviv, thank you so much for spending the time with me today.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now. Please check out another installment next week. This episode was produced by the Podwaves and video edited by Thomas Gersh. Until next week, Shalom.